Before I tell you how my own blood tried to bury me alive in a glass house, let me ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you forgot to imagine their betrayal? Have you ever looked at a family member and thought, no, not them, never them, they could never want me gananned, then felt the knife anyway? If you know that feeling, lean closer. Because my name is Dr. Eleanor Voss. I'm 71 years old. I've outlived sandstorms, scandals, and one catastrophic marriage. But what nearly killed me wasn't the desert sun or the years of political enemies I made. No, it was someone who grew up at my sister's kitchen table. Someone who wore my family's smile. I've been accused of being many things. Stubborn, brilliant, difficult, even impossible. The truth is, I was an environmental engineer and botanist long before it was fashionable. I've seen oil executives quake under my testimony and governments bristle when I exposed their corruption. When I retired 10 years ago, I didn't carry gold or diamonds with me into the Moroccan desert. What I carried was knowledge. And not just in my head. In my archive beneath this house sits the world's largest private collection of rare botanical manuscripts. Maps and patents worth more than $50 million. It is my life's work, my pride, and apparently, my curse. I live in a desert oasis town near the shifting dunes where silence is never really silent. The wind hisses across the palms, the earth cracks at dawn. The sand itself whispers like it remembers every secret buried under it. The desert, I've learned, is like an old woman. It never forgets. And neither do I, Adrian, my sister Marianne's only son. If you met him, you might be charmed. He's handsome, slick, and sharp enough to sell water to a drowning man. He works in international trade, which in his case is a polite phrase for lying in 3 languages. I used to try to believe he meant well. He was, after all, Marianne's boy. And Marianne, God rest her, died 15 years ago, believing her son would eventually discover his soul. I wanted to believe it too. But I've learned the hard way that some people never go looking for their souls at all. The first sign came with water. My greenhouse is the one place in this desert where life always bursts at the seams. I walked in one evening to check the irrigation valve and nearly slipped. The floor was flooded, gallons pouring across the tiles. Rare seedlings, my delicate desert orchids, my experimental hybrid succulents were drowning. I bent down, checked the pipes, and saw the cleanest slice across the main supply line. Pipes don't slice themselves open. Someone had been there. Someone wanted to destroy what I loved. I remember the sound of my own voice, muttering into the humid dark. Nice try, sweetheart. But you'll have to do better than that, and wouldn't you know, the very next morning Adrian arrived. Linen trousers, designer sunglasses, a rented black Mercedes gleaming in the sun. He stepped out, arms wide, smiling like a prodigal son returning to the fold. Ellie, he said, you look radiant. Retirement suits you. I raised an eyebrow. Radiant was not the word for an old woman in a khaki shirt streaked with soil and a sun hat that had survived 2 decades of sandstorms. But Adrian had always been fluent in flattery, and flattery is just a weapon with softer edges. We drank mint tea in the courtyard, the kind of ritual tourists think is quaint, but locals know is serious business. He leaned back too casual and asked, so, what's new with the collection? Any plans to secure its future? His voice was sugar, but there was steel underneath. I smiled back, stirring sugar into my tea. Oh, it's all secured, darling. Ironclad. Why are you interested in botany all of a sudden? He chuckled, but I caught the flicker in his eyes. Just a second's glance toward the locked door leading to my archive below. That flicker told me more than his words ever could. After he left, I couldn't sit still. I pulled out a wooden box from behind a bookshelf, one I hadn't touched in decades. Inside were my old paints and brushes. Once before the degrees and patents, I painted flowers mostly the way a scientist paints, with veins and pollen grains rendered in obsessive detail. That afternoon, I set up a canvas in the courtyard and sketched the desert horizon at dusk. The purples and golds bled into one another, and for the first time in years, I felt calm. It was as if the desert whispered back, Ellie, you are still more than your fears. I thought of Marianne. She was the wild one, my opposite in every way. Music instead of science, laughter instead of logic. When she died, Adrian called me with a voice flat as paper, already thinking about inheritances. But in her last real conversation with me, she'd said, "Don't be so hard on him. He's ambitious, yes, but he'll learn where his soul is." I wonder, even now, she'd still defend him after what he's done. A few nights later, I woke to a humming noise outside my window. At first, I thought it was wind threading the palms, but no, the rhythm was mechanical. I wrapped myself in a robe, grabbed a heavy brass lamp, and went to the greenhouse. The heat hit me like a wall. My ventilation system was blasting at maximum. The thermostat tampered with, set to 45 degrees. My rarest specimens would have been scorched to husks by morning. And then I smelled it, gasoline, faint but sharp, near the electrical wiring. Someone hadn't just wanted to ruin my plants. They had wanted a fire, a blaze that would consume my house, my archive, maybe even me. For the first time in decades, my knees went weak. I'm not easily rattled, but that night I was. I shut everything down, then sat on the greenhouse floor, pressing my palm to the tile to ground myself. I whispered into the dark, "Adrian, if this is you, you've made the worst mistake of your life." The next morning at the cafe, where I always take my black coffee, there was an envelope waiting for me. Plain white. No name. Inside, a flash drive. I turned it over in my hand, weighing its cheap plastic like it was a loaded gun. Back home. Behind locked doors and closed curtains, I slid it into my laptop. 3 files appeared. Evidence1.jpg, testimony.pdf, transfer.docx. The photo came first. It showed me standing in front of a reservoir, pointing at pipes, spewing dark water. The timestamp said 2021. Only problem, I was in Geneva that week, giving a lecture. And the image looked wrong, my face pasted like a bad sticker. The PDF was worse. A supposed testimony from a local farmer claiming I took bribes to cover up toxic waste dumping. His signature at the bottom, but I knew that name. He'd been dead 10 years, and then the document. A draft contract. $10 million supposedly transferred to me in exchange for silencing research about a genetically modified plant. My name, my forged signature, even my passport number typed neatly in black ink. I slammed the laptop shut. My heart pounded so hard it rattled my ribs. This wasn't just scare tactics. This was a case being built, stone by stone, against me. Someone wanted me branded as corrupt, stripped of everything I'd built, maybe even thrown in prison. And the only way they could have known those details, my passport number. My history was if they'd been close. Family-close.adrian. I sat with my paints drying on the easel and my tea gone cold. Outside, the desert shifted and whispered as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. I pressed my palms together, breathed through the panic, and made myself a promise. If it was war he wanted, then war was what he'd get. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the shutters sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind like whispered laughter. I stayed at my desk until dawn, watching the desert turn from black to gray to gold. When the sun finally rose, I made myself a decision. If Adrian thought he could break me with lies, I would let him keep thinking I was fragile. Sometimes survival isn't about showing your strength, it's about playing the part of prey long enough for the predator to step closer. The next day, I walked to the souk, my usual routine. You should understand something about this oasis town. It's both ancient and modern. Men in traditional jalabas sell mobile phones beside stalls of spices. Women haggle over cumin and saffron while tourists photograph everything as if they discovered it. In this swirl of life, I've always been invisible. That invisibility saved me. Because when I rounded the corner by the date sellers, I saw him, Adrian, on his phone, speaking French too quickly for any tourist to follow. His face was tight, his hands slicing the air as if commanding someone. I ducked behind a stall stacked with copper pots. My heart thudded, but I forced myself to stay calm. His voice carried just enough for me to catch. "Tonight, yes. Make sure the old woman is inside," then laughter low and cold. Before he strolled off as though he owned the desert itself. Inside, he wanted me inside. That night, I worked in the greenhouse again, deliberately leaving the lights on. If he had planned something, I wanted to see it. I watered the orchids slowly, humming an old tune Marianne used to play on her guitar. Hours passed, nothing, until a crack, sharp, a sound from above. I looked up. The ceiling beams trembled. For a second, I didn't understand. And then it hit me. Not the realization, but the beam itself. The wooden frame above groaned, split, and dropped in a thunderous arc. By instinct, I threw myself sideways, hitting the tile floor so hard I bit my tongue. Dust and shards rained down, the crash deafening. A piece of glass from the panel above sliced across my shoulder. Hot blood ran down my arm. I lay there, chest heaving, staring at the beam just inches from where my skull would have been. If I hadn't moved, if I hadn't been waiting for something, I'd be gone. A neat obituary. Renowned botanist dies in greenhouse accident. My life reduced to a headline. My collection conveniently inherited. I pulled myself upright, dizzy but alive. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I realized Adrian had underestimated me. Again, still, blood doesn't stop for pride. My shoulder wouldn't quit bleeding, and I knew better than to patch it alone. So I walked stumbling a little to the workshop at the edge of town. To YUSUF was once a detective in Casablanca, before retirement drew him to the quiet of the oasis. Now he carved wooden boxes, sold them to tourists, and watched more than anyone realized. I'd known him for years in passing, but never really spoken beyond greetings. That night, I knocked on his door at midnight, robe torn, blood staining my shirt. He opened the door, eyes widening, then narrowing with the kind of calculation only old detectives carry. "Dr. Voss," he said, his voice low. "Come inside." He cleaned the wound with steady hands, muttering that I should have come sooner. I sat at his table, the scent of cedar and dust around me, and finally said it. "Someone is trying to kill me." He didn't flinch, didn't gasp or laugh. He only nodded once, as if confirming a theory he already had. "Your nephew." I stared. How he gave a thin smile. "Everyone in this town has seen him. The way he watches your house, the way he speaks to men with no reason to be here. I may carve wood now, but my eyes still work. For the first time in weeks." I felt something loosen in my chest. Relief. I wasn't crazy. Someone else saw it too. I told him about the flash drive, the sabotage, the staged accident. He listened in silence, his fingers tapping the table. When I finished, he said, "Then you cannot fight this alone. He is not stupid. If he forges evidence, he has allies. Money can buy clever devils. You must be cleverer." I sipped the mint tea he set before me, though my hands trembled. "And how do I do that?" "First," he said, "you let him think you are cornered. Second, you gather proof. And third," his eyes, dark and sharp, met mine, "you remind him that a woman who survives the desert is not a woman to be underestimated. We agreed to meet again." Quietly, under the pretense of me buying one of his boxes. "A signal," he said. If the shutters of his shop were half closed, it was safe to talk. When I left, dawn was breaking. The desert was pink and gold, alive with the sound of roosters and prayer calls. My arm ached, my shoulder burned, but inside I felt sharper than I had in years. Adrian wanted a cornered old woman. Instead, he just handed me a partner. Over the next days, I played my part. I limped a little more than I needed to. I spoke with neighbors in tones of worry, making sure Adrian's spies, if he had them, would hear. And sure enough, Adrian appeared again. This time with a gift. A silver necklace too ornate for my taste, pressed into my hand as he kissed my cheek. "Aunt Ellie," he said smoothly, "you must be careful. These desert houses are dangerous, so fragile. I worry about you here all alone." I met his gaze, smiled sweetly. "Oh, don't you worry about me. I'm tougher than I look." He tilted his head. "Are you?" That night I sat with Yusuf in his workshop, the necklace between us on the table. He turned it over, then held it up to the light. His brow furrowed. "This clasp. It is hollow. He fetched a tiny blade, worked it carefully, and out popped a chip no bigger than a grain of rice. A tracker. I swallowed hard. He wants to know where I am at all times. Yusuf nodded. Good. Then we give him what he expects. He set the necklace back together and smiled. A wolfish grin I hadn't expected from a retired craftsman. Sometimes, the best way to hunt a jackal is to let him think he is circling you, while you lead him to the trap. For the first time in weeks, I laughed. A real laugh deep in my chest. Maybe I was bleeding, maybe I was hunted, but I was also alive, and I wasn't done yet. The necklace burned against my skin for days, though I wore it as if it meant the world to me. Adrian watched me closely whenever he visited, his eyes lingering on the chain at my throat. He thought he was clever, monitoring my every move. Let him. Sometimes the easiest way to fool a man is to give him exactly what he wants to see. But Yusuf and I had work to do. The tracker gave us an advantage. It showed us not just what Adrian was watching, but also when he was distracted. Yusuf had a friend, an old contact from his detective days, who still had access to a few useful tools. Late one night, in the back of his workshop, we hooked the necklace's chip into an old scanner. What we saw made my stomach knot. Every signal it sent was bouncing not to a simple phone, but to a server. That server was part of a larger network hidden behind layers of fake companies. And at the center of it, an address I recognized. A building in Casablanca I'd testified about years ago, during a corruption case. Adrian wasn't just building lies with his own hands. He had inherited the tools of my old enemies. I leaned back, the wood chair creaking. So he's not just greedy. He's clever enough to make me the villain. The corrupt scientist who covered up contamination. He ruins my name, claims my collection, and walks away smelling like roses. Yusuf tapped the table. Clever men make mistakes when they think no one else is clever. We'll find the crack. The crack came sooner than I expected. A woman named Selma knocked at my door one afternoon. Young, maybe 30, carrying a child on her hip. Her face was lined not by age, but by exhaustion. She said she was a farmer's daughter. It's from the northern valley where my old irrigation projects had been built. Dr. Voss, she said. Voice trembling. They say you betrayed us. That you took money to poison the water. Her eyes filled with tears. My husband. He believed it. He left, and now my family is breaking. Tell me, is it true? The words hit harder than the falling beam had. Because I saw the pain in her eyes, the doubt that Adrian had planted, and I knew the damage was already spreading. My reputation wasn't just at stake, was ripping through lives that trusted me once. I knelt to her level, put my hand over hers. No, Salma. I swear on everything I have, everything I am. I never took a bribe. The water projects were my life's work. This is a lie. Someone is trying to destroy me, and you are caught in the fire. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. But as she left, I saw her shoulders sag. Lies are sticky things, even when people want to believe the truth. They can't always scrape the lies off. That night, I told Yusuf. His jaw tightened. He has begun to use others as weapons. That means he is desperate. But it also means someone will get hurt before this ends. And someone did, a week later. Fire engines screamed through the narrow streets. Smoke blackened the sky over the souk. I pushed through the crowd, heart in my throat, until I saw the wreckage. Yusuf's workshop. Flames had eaten it hollow. Men doused the embers with hoses. Women cried out prayers. I searched frantically for him, coughing on the smoke. Until I found him sitting on the curb, face blackened. Coughing hard, but alive. It wasn't me they meant to kill, he rasped. It was the boy. I turned. One of his apprentices, barely 20, had been carried out on a stretcher. Burned badly, unconscious. The crowd murmured that an oil lamp must have fallen. But Yusuf's eyes met mine, and we both knew better. This was a message. Adrian had grown tired of waiting for me to die. Now he was cutting down anyone near me. Guilt surged through me, sharp as glass. The boy hadn't asked for this. He hadn't even known my name. And yet he lay between life and death because Adrian wanted me gone. Back at my house, I paced like a caged animal. He's not just after me anymore, I said aloud, though only the walls listened. He'll burn the whole town if he has to. He'll burn the desert itself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm into Adrian's rented villa and drag him out by his expensive collar. But I knew rage was exactly what he wanted. He'd lure me into a trap and then headline obituary, inheritance. So instead, I picked up my brush. I painted the smoke, the boy's pale face, the way the desert wind bent under heat. When I set the canvas down, my hands were steady. And I whispered, Adrian, you've made it personal now, and I'm done waiting. Yusuf recovered enough to limp to my house 2 days later. His eyes were bloodshot from the smoke, but his mind was sharp. He dropped a folder on my table. Inside were names, numbers, connections, every contact he'd traced through Adrian's server. He is not alone, Yusuf said. He has partners, lawyers, traders, men with too much money and too little conscience. But I found something else. He pulled out a single sheet. A transfer request. 50 million to be released upon my legal discreditation or death. I stared at it, the number swimming before my eyes. $50 million. My collection's value written coldly in black ink. It wasn't just about greed anymore. It was already set in motion. Adrian had promised my fortune to men who wanted it more than life itself. And that was when I understood. This wasn't a family feud. This was a conspiracy, and my nephew had lit the fuse. I set a plan in motion the way I'd taught students to approach an experiment. Controlled, patient, and with the humility to expect the unexpected. Rage is a poor lab partner. It clouds your measurements and makes you forget the controls. So I kept my face soft, my movements ordinary, and my mind sharp as a scalpel. First, we needed proof that Adrian wasn't just a greedy nephew with bad manners. He was a node in a wider web, and webs have threads you can tug. Yusuf dug like a terrier, using contacts from days when he still had a badge and an office that smelled of paper and stale coffee. He called in favors from an old friend at the port, a man who still had eyes on ship manifests. I called an old colleague in Geneva who still had access to legal databases. We've pieced together fragment payments routed through shell companies. Shipping containers declared textiles that in fact held archival crates. Emails routed through VPNs with names that matched the lawyers in Yusuf's. Folder dot while Yusuf tracked the network and tested the tracker signals. I went to work in a more literal sense. I examined everything Adrian might use to build his case against me. The forged documents on the flash drive were neat, clinical, like the work of someone who thought of forgery as paperwork rather than a crime. Forensics would shred them in a cube of red tape, but courts rarely liked to wait for lab reports. We needed something immediate, something irrefutable, and something that smelled literally of the desert I'd walked for 50 years. You'll laugh when I tell you what I thought of. Lichens. Small, stubborn organisms that colonize the loneliest rocks. They're geniuses at surviving extremes. And they leave microscopic signatures everywhere. Spores, fragments, chemical traces. I had spent decades cataloging desert lichens and fungi for drought-resistant projects. Some of those species grew only in the microclimate of my greenhouse, nurtured by a blend of irrigation water, cedar shavings, and a strain of compost I'd developed myself. That compost carried a fingerprint of DNA and microfossils, no ecology. Student could mistake, if I could, find traces of my greenhouse microbes on Adrian's evidence, or on the clothing of people who'd visited my archive. It would tie him to the scene in a way no cleanly typed PDF ever could. It would scream visibly, wetly planted. So I set to work. I collected soil samples, leaves from the rare cactus hybrids, swabs from the cedar shelves. I knew enough lab technique to keep them sterile, label them properly, package them so they'd be admissible if the day ever came we needed them in court. Yusuf handled other things. Cameras installed in the courtyard disguised as ornaments. An old-fashioned motion sensor linked to a phone line and delicate. Mostly illegal but effective little devices that pinged when someone came within a footprint of my archive door. We baited Adrian with a small, petty thing because predators like to bite small pieces before they take the whole loaf. I accidentally let it be known in the cafe and at the school where I taught a popular guest lecture that a recent appraisal had turned up an early folio in my collection, a watercolor sketch Marianne had once owned. It was nothing an unsigned study of no value compared to the patents, but in his ears it would sound like a foot in the door. And Adrian, like most men whose appetites outweigh their judgment, took the bait. The tracker on the necklace gave us a pattern. He came around more often when the moon was low and the souk was noisy. If he couldn't find me, he would find those who knew me. He sent couriers to question old partners, men with papered smiles and pockets lined with other men's money. Once Yusuf and I trailed a suspicious sedan into the city and watched a handoff under a bridge papers exchanged. A cool nod. I took close-up photos with a camera tucked in my scarf. It's a trick I learned when I once had to document illegal logging in a court case. He was careful, but not careful enough. That charged patience snapped the night my car tried to kill me. It was a simple drive to Casablanca. It's the kind I'd made dozens of times in my life. I'd packed a small portfolio of documents, some of the soil swabs tucked into a padded case. I told Yusuf I was simply going for a meeting with a lawyer friend. Truth. Mostly, but less important than the need for motion to sniff out the jackal. Adrian's tracker pinged as usual. He must have known I was leaving. Maybe he thought a long ride would give him space to act. Maybe he thought an accident would look natural. In the dark ribbon of highway that snakes between barren plains and scrub dot, I remember the first unusual thing. As a soft resistance under foot brake. Pressure that felt like a glove filled with water. The pedal went down too far. My heart did something odd, as if a bird dropped inside my chest. My engineering instinct kicked in before the fear. Check redundancies. If the hydraulic system fails, engage the parking brake and downshift. Trucks taught me that lesson in my 30s when I had to haul equipment through mountain passes. I put my palm against the dash and yanked the manual handbrake. Nothing. The car kept coasting as if on a greased track. The desolate lights of distant settlements smeared into ribbons. A voice on the radio static and then a bit of pop music felt obscene in the moment. I looked into the rearview mirror. No car behind me. No shadow. Just sand and the bruised sky. I tried to steer toward the soft shoulder, but the steering felt woolly, as if someone had stuffed it with cotton. I could see a curve coming up, a banked arc that would flip a car like a coin. I am not reckless in my driving. I am precise, because plants do not forgive sloppy handling. I tried to calculate angles, speeds, and wheel torque in scant heartbeats. If the hydraulic brakes were sabotaged, perhaps the engine could act as a retarder. I downshifted, tapping the gear lever like a cautious surgeon. The revs climbed. The engine grumbled and, maddeningly, the car sped up. Someone had tampered with the throttle linkage. It was deliberate. A mechanical conspiracy of metal and malice. The desert is a place where the mind either sharpens or snaps. Mine sharpened. I thought of centrifugal force and the way dunes gather wind. The same physics that keeps a wheel glued to a road if you respect velocity. I eased the wheel, nudged it toward the slight depression on the shoulder where gravel gathered. The car fought me, but physics keeps to its rules. Sand slows faster than asphalt if you can angle a car into it and cut speed without a violent jerk. I aimed for the soft patch, felt the tires bite, and the car responded grudgingly. It rumbled like a beast that had been given a stern talking to. Just as I thought I had it, a shock of metal struck the side. A heavy impact like a fist through the door. Someone had run a bolt into the guardrail at the exact height of my door. A crude, murderous pretzel of iron. My side window shattered in a constellation of glass, and a sliver scraped my cheek. Adrenaline burned, a white-hot clarity. Someone had tried to toss me into the canyon like a paperweight. The car finally surrendered to the sand. Lurching to a stop on a flat, silent shoulder, I fumbled in my bag, pulled out my phone, and dialed Yusuf. My hands shook, but not from panic. From anger. He picked up on the second ring, Voice low and steady. Ellie. Adrian, I said. He tried, and then the line clipped. The battery blinked red. Someone had jammed the signal. Someone had thought of everything. I could have screamed. I could have sat and waited for whoever had struck me to finish the job and claim the quiet as a cover. Instead, I did what I had always done in the face of breakdown. I improvised. I undid my scarf, tied it around the wound on my cheek to staunch the blood. Then I collected my samples, the soil swabs, the tiny vials, the sealed envelope with my lab notes. If they were going to claim I was dead or discredited, there would be living proof somewhere. I tucked them into a small canvas bag and walked. The road was empty, stars like indifferent eyes overhead, and the air smelled of iron and diesel. I walked until I found a farmhouse light, until someone with a radio heard my voice and took me in. Days later, the newspapers ran the story in small print. Local heiress survives crash. They mentioned suspected mechanical failure, as if it were a polite suggestion from the gods. Adrian ran to the cameras, wearing the familiar polished smile and an expression of concern that would make a saint suspicious. "It's devastating," he said. "I hope she recovers." His eyes flicked to the camera, calculating the spin. But I had what mattered. The little canvas bag had my soil samples intact. When a nurse's hand shook and she slid me a piece of bread, I asked the doctor if I could be allowed a simple favor: a sterile swab and a clean, sealed container. He looked at me like I'd asked to pet the moon, but he humored a patient with money and curiosity. I swabbed the inside lip of my shirt where the glass had whispered against me and sealed it. It felt absurdly hopeful, like leaving breadcrumbs in a storm. But breadcrumbs are sometimes all detectives have. Yusuf's network moved. He put out small fires contacts who could move quickly, sheltered me while we arranged for lab analysis. I sent one of the soil swabs to my old colleague in Geneva under the cover of personal samples for an exhibition, and slipped another to a botanical forensic lab in Rabi using a friend of a friend. Forensics is a patient hunter. It takes time to yell its conclusions in clear, unignorable capitals, but when it does, the world listens. While we waited for lab results, we played a dangerous game. We baited and watched. Yusuf staged a fake sale of one small manuscript to a buyer in Casablanca. Adrian took the bait, predictably, and the day the courier appeared at his villa to collect the purchase, Yusuf's hidden camera caught a man one of the shell company lawyer's hand over a sealed envelope. Later, Yusuf slipped into Adrian's backyard, and with a surgeon's steadiness I didn't know he possessed, retrieved the envelope. Inside were receipts, a stamped shipping manifest, and a receipt with a fingerprint smudged across the corner. The paper had fibers that matched a brand of archival paper I used. The fingerprint, when run through Yusuf's retired channels, matched a man who ran a shipping company that had broached my case before. It wasn't the dramatic confession I wanted, the kind you see in courtroom dramas, but it was a rope. You tug on one end and parts of the web tremble. Lab results arrived like a slow, bright sunrise. The Geneva analysis came back first. The soil samples contained a strain of cyanobacteria uniquely cultivated in my greenhouse's compost. The Rabi lab identified residues of a lichen spore that only grows in the microclimate. It's created by the cedar-lined shelves of my archive. In short, microscopic. Stubborn evidence that the evidence against me had been in contact with my greenhouse. I read the reports under a thin hospital blanket, tears burning my eyes. Not from pain, though, the crash had its scars, but from a furious, glowing sort of joy. Evidence that could be understood by anyone paying attention. Evidence that was slow and silent as soil and therefore hard to argue with. Even a judge can't look a spore in the face and say it's a lie. We took the reports to a lawyer in Casablanca who owed me a favor from a long-ago hearing. He frowned, then smiled, and the kind of smile lawyers have when they smell a win. He told me, in words like soft stones, that we had enough to file for an injunction to protect the collection and to request a criminal investigation into the forged documents and the attempts on my life. He warned me that court moves slowly and men with money move faster. He advised caution. I did not like the idea of caution. But sometimes the smartest move is to let rumble and thunder do their work while you dig the trap. I published nothing, posted nothing. But I let small stories leak an interview about a local project here. A photograph there so Adrian's men would think I was fragile and disoriented. We needed him to come closer, to make mistakes. And he did. He grew sloppier, more insistent. He began to speak to people with less care, flaunting the idea that he would control my estate someday. He started making phone calls at odd hours to Yusuf's known associates trying to buy loyalty. Once, I heard him laugh on the street with men who dressed like businessmen and smelled of cigarette ash and offshore accounts. He was getting cocky. That cockiness is what led to the moment I'd been waiting for. Yusuf and I arranged a meeting in the Medina, ostensibly to discuss the sale of one of his carved boxes. The shutters were half closed, our signal end. The air smelled of warmed saffron. I wore the necklace, tracker and all, and Yusuf seemed to be his usual distracted self. Polishing the rim of a box that had been carved with the flourish of a hand that had once opened safes. Adrian came. He walked in like he owned the place, like he owned any place he entered. He sat across from us, restless fingers drumming against the wood. His voice had a brittle edge. "You two are a nuisance," he said. "You know that. Prying into things that don't concern you." I smiled. "We're just old women with curious hands." The lie tasted sweet. He leaned forward then, and his voice softened into something he used for greater betrayals. Intimacy. "Ellie, you should consider what's best. For the family. For the town." His gaze flicked to Yusuf for a beat too long. "You could make this go away." I saw the man behind the smile then, desperate, arrogant, certain that his money and networks could sculpt reality. I stood up slowly and walked to the far side of the shop toward a small window where boxes dried in the sun. Yusuf lifted his chin. "You talk like men who have never lost anything," he said quietly. Adrian laughed. "Oh, we've lost things. That's the point, you have things others want." Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his pocket and produced a small black thumb drive, the kind that stores gigs of audio and video. "I've been patient," he said. "But patience wears thin." He tapped the drive against the table. "You should give it up, Lee. The world doesn't want to hear about the past." The words were a surgeon's blade. But the drive of triviality was our opening. I let a slow smile form. One of those smiles that are all teeth and no surrender. "Is that all?" I asked, voice light. "You think you can scare me with plastic?" Yusuf's fingers tightened on the table. Adrian's mouth twitched. "You'll change your tune when the right images get out." He was playing for position. And positions are how lawyers win estate wars. But I was not without means. I palmed my phone and activated a recorder app I'd used in court to capture testimony years ago. My hands were steady. I said ordinary things, asked ordinary questions, and let him speak. Men who build conspiracies often forget that words are the easiest thing to record. They speak as if their audience is made of ghosts. Adrian took the bait, he explained. In a rush, in the greasy confidence of a man who assumes that his listeners share his ethics. How the payments would be funneled, how the forged documents would smear me, and how they would initiate a transfer on a technicality after discreditation. He spoke of men who would make sure the local press was quiet. He named a lawyer I'd once crossed. He named a shipping company. He spoke as if he were planning a garden and not arranging deeds to steal another's life. I recorded it. Yusuf watched him like a hawk, fingers twitching. When Adrian finished, he leaned back, satisfied, and took a last sip of mint tea. "You'll be gone soon," he said, as if that were a benediction. "You're very generous to think so," I replied. But generosity is overrated. We waited until he left, and then Yusuf and I went through the recording. It was ugly, damning, and candid. Adrian's voice was full of his own self-satisfaction. It would be enough to call the police, but men with money can make records vanish with a sigh. We needed more. We needed the people who would still tell the truth even when it cost them. We needed witnesses who could not be bought by the shine of offshore accounts. For that, we turned to Marianne's old friends. And to the town itself. You might think small towns take sides, but the truth is smarter. Towns take truth. Once the smoke from the workshop fire had settled and Yusuf's apprentice had recovered enough to tell what he could, people began to look at Adrian differently. A fisherman who'd lost a contract because of a forged shipping manifest came forward. A librarian in Rabi remembered a call from a shell company asking if a rare folio had been listed. They were small things, small threads, but string enough threads and you weave a net. And yet, on the evening, the net was nearly ready. The dessert turned on me again. I was walking home through a narrow lane, my canvas bag slung over my shoulder. The sky was an iron bowl, and the sea of sand beyond the town was cold as old knives. I had been thinking of paintings of the way light collects on a woman's cheek in late afternoon, when a shadow fell across the lane. Two men stepped out from a doorway, slow and deliberate. One of them had a face I recognized from photographs, the fixer from a shipping company. The man with the smudged fingerprint. The other's face was unreadable. Before I could react, they lunged. The first moved like a man who had practiced this motion, grabbing for my bag, pushing me against the wall. The second reached for my throat with a gloved hand. The world narrowed to the scrape of glove against skin and this sudden thud of my heart. I smelled gasoline again. A cruel reminder. I did the only thing women who survive learn to do. I made myself small and then suddenly, outrageously dangerous. I kicked with a heel that had once balanced on lab stools and stung a man's shin like a whip. I drove my knee upward and something in the second man's grin broke. He staggered. The bag, my precious bag with samples, tore. Vials clinked. One shattered. Soil spattered across ancient stone. They ran. They left me with bruises, a torn sleeve, and a new, ugly certainty. They would not stop until I was either gagged by the desert or hoisted into oblivion by an offshore crane. When I staggered home, Yusuf was waiting, eyes like a wet storm. He had found out where the fixer kept a small ledger and had matched names. He had also arranged for a woman, a retired judge who owed me a kindness, to come to town. She would oversee a small discreet hearing to make sure evidence was preserved. We had enough to make someone with the right temperament want to stand up. But temperament is a rare bird. That night, I painted. I painted my own body, the bruises and the tear in my sleeve, the way fear looked like an old friend sitting across from me. I painted the desert sky and how it had watched us both predator and prey move like chess pieces. I painted because paint anchors you to the thing you are. And I was a woman who had spent a life making invisible things visible. Spores, contracts, diseases, the slow theft of rivers. I wasn't going to let my story vanish under smog and grease. We filed our complaints. We presented the lab reports and Yusuf's recording to a small but determined investigator in Casablanca. He was a man who had seen too many cases go cold because someone in the political class had a nicer suit. He listened to every word, read every report, and then, when the time came, looked me in the eye and said, "You have more than suspicion. You have a pattern." His words were cautious, but they were a beginning. Adrian reacted like a man who had realized his hands were closer to the trap than his head. He grew louder in public, using the same confident voice that had once asked me about the future of my collection. He started to make mistakes, slipping names in the wrong places, returning to scenes he had already been seen at, underestimating the patience of those he thought old and weak. But patience alone does not win a war. It is cunning and stubbornness, and the willingness to be cruel to the self that takes it to the end. I called Marianne in my head, more often than I called anyone else. Her laugh, her terrible, glorious appetite for life, were the bright thread I tugged when fear tried to bind me. In the quiet hours, as the desert cooled and the cicadas murmured like small conspirators, I would set my brush down and whisper into the dim, "You were wrong about him, sister. He did not find his soul." Then I would smile at the ridiculousness of thinking a man could have a one-night stand with morality, wake up repentant. The net tightened. Men who once accepted envelopes now had cold hands when they took them. The small shipping company man tried to change his story. The lawyer who'd been seen with Adrian's men resigned suddenly, leaving a trailing note about personal matters. People like that know how to vanish into plausible chaos. But even plausible chaos has its footprints. We were closing in. I could feel it in the way Yusuf's hand tapped the table, in the way the retired judge's eyes brightened when she read the lab reports, in the way neighbors began to look past me with something like respect instead of pity. Justice, like a slow plant, grows if you water it steadily. And yet, as any gardener will tell you, the night before harvest is when thieves choose to strike. One evening, someone broke into the archive. They did not come to steal the rare folios, which are heavy and awkward and worth far more in public scandal than in a tawdry backroom sale. They came for the one box I kept locked in a cedar chest, a small portfolio Marianne had given me. Items of memory rather than worth. They cut the lock with a blade used by tradesmen. They left fingerprints clumsy and hurried. I stood in that room afterward, the cedar air thick with the ghost of paper, and felt a rage so bright it made me dizzy. You can steal manuscripts, but you cannot steal what a person carries in their ribs. Or so I told myself. The fingerprints matched none of the known men. They matched a thorny path, someone who had been an ad hoc employee of Adrian's people, a man who had also been seen near Yusuf's workshop. We had names, and we had more. We had the recording of Adrian's confession, the lab reports, witnesses ready to speak. The machinery of justice, slow and clumsy, had a mechanized heart now beating faster. But men with money can still buy time. And time was the one piece Adrian had left in abundance. We prepared for courtroom chess, for the dirty tricks, for the smear pieces that would appear in the press like tumors. I wrote in the dark. A letter not for the judge or the lawyer, but for the world. A short plea for people who had been hurt by rumor to speak up. I planned to share it on the channel that had first followed my work, an old friend who ran a podcast about women in science, and I asked Yusuf to secure the files on cloud servers with redundancies. We made copies of everything and stored them with people who had nothing to gain from me and everything to lose by my disgrace. Adrian made one final misstep. He tried to make an example of someone close to him, someone he thought I loved more than my work. But that, if you'll allow me a little indulgence, is a story for another night. For now, know this: the traps men set for others have a way of snagging their own feet. And women who survive storms keep their hands empty, but their pockets full of seeds. If you're still with Maya, you've hit subscribe. If you've tapped the bell and promised to come back, thank you. There are more nights to tell you about. More turns of the wheel, a confrontation that smells of copper and despair. An unintended confession caught on a recorder that smells faintly of the cedar of Yusuf's boxers. There will be arrests, yes, and courtrooms. But there will also be painting and a garden, and, if the desert is kind, a new project to teach young women the stubborn science of survival. Keep your comments coming below. Tell me of a time you were betrayed and how you rose. I read them. I learned from them. We are, between all of us, a stubborn community of survivors.